All right, why don't we get started? Welcome to this seminar on the FADGI guidelines and the new digital permanent record regulations that are coming downstream probably later this year sometime. I'm John Mancini. Welcome here. You can probably tell that I'm in the worldwide broadcasting headquarters with my fancy bookcase in back of me on a non-green screen environment. And one of my co-panelists today did point out that it's not as fancy. If you look close, you can see all my bobbleheads in the background. So welcome. It's great to be here. I run a consulting firm called Content Results, also the author of a book called Immigrant Secrets. And I have two very knowledgeable people here today. And maybe we could just start with a short introduction. And so Don, why don't you tell us a tiny bit about yourself, and then Scott, you can follow.
Okay, I am Don Williams, and I've been working in the digital imaging community for the last 45 years, the last 15 of which has been outside of, and there's the clock. I thought you had stopped all. I'm sorry, folks. But for John, we're right on time.
And as luck would have it, it was 11, not 1. So
okay. That's right. So most of my career was at Kodak in the digital imaging side, and I had a great exposure to all kinds of digital imaging, reconnaissance, medical, business, and most of it, almost all of it, was in the image quality side. And in 2007, I left Kodak and I started working. I got some contracts with the Library of Congress on helping to set up their quality control programs for all their content digitization, film, prints and photographs, geography and maps. And I still work with them today. And I helped quite a bit with setting up these FADGI guidelines.
Great. Scott, how about you?
Said I was going to watch that. So Scott Swidersky, been in the information management and content management industry for a bit over 20 years. Currently with Konica Minolta, which was an organization that I had previously run with Quality Associates. And so Quality Associates was acquired by Konica Minolta in 2016. I've spent the majority of my career in both the systems integration space, solving data and information problems for mostly the public sector, but also have worked quite a bit in the private sector as well. Running and managing complex, large BPO centers is something else that I've had extensive experience with, which is where I think I have found myself on this panel today, and FADGI becoming a requirement on some of the projects that we work on, and also where we see a popular standard coming here in the near future. So thanks, John.
Great. So the way we'll run this today is that Scott and I will kind of bookend this. You know, the real meat and potatoes in this is going to be from Don, who has alluded to has rich experience in this realm. So I'll kick this off. And I thought I'd start here just in terms of giving you a little bit of a flavor for the audience, and also maybe a hint of what we're trying to accomplish here. So this was from the people attending the webinar here today. And so a couple points about this. One is that what we're going to try to do here is not answer every single question in all of its glory about imaging standards, but what we want to try to do is open the conversation. And then given that the level of knowledge about FADGI and what it does, as you can see from the chart, is not as high as it might be. So we want to introduce the topic, have a conversation about it, and then use it as a springboard for some future seminars that we'll do probably after the first of the year. The other thing that I should say is that our approach here in talking about these upcoming new permanent record digitization standards is a kind of a FADGI-centric approach. And the reason for that is because of this slide, because the awareness is fairly low. But FADGI and the digital standards that NARA is proposing are two different things. And the way that they tie together, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is that when NARA starts talking about the suitable standards for permanent records, they tie it back to FADGI 3, and I'll tell you what that's about in a minute, as a minimum. So they're two different things. So, there's the whole FADGI process, which is focused on the imaging standards, and there is the NARA process to approve the standards that were initially published in the Federal Register back in December of 2020. Hopefully are nearing some mode of completion at this point in terms of going through the federal process, but they're two different things. And I just wanted to explain why we were FADGI centric, if you will, during this conversation today. So this is where it all started in terms of, thinking about this and why a lot of people are paying attention to FADGI right now is the proposed digitization standards for permanent records. And I have a link here. We'll send you all these slides so that you can get access to the original materials. As I said, the NARA published these in the Federal Register back in December. There was a comment period thereafter, the consolidation of the comments, and then I imagine a little bit of a slowdown in the process because of the change of administration, but it will be coming soon in terms of the finalization of all of this. So it covers permanent records, and that's, I think, one aspect that people need to keep in mind. I personally think that as we define standards for permanent records, it will start to bleed down into records that also have less than permanent retention periods, because it's kind of a good practice, if you will, in terms of having good, high quality images with which to work. But the rule itself and the rulemaking itself only covers permanent records, which are a minority of the overall records that are processed by any organization. And so what they did was tie the image quality that was necessary to have for permanent records, and so that the original could be destroyed, they tied it back to what's called FADGI 3-star image quality. And one of the things to keep in mind in the regulation is that if previously digitized records are not in compliance with that level of quality, they may need to be digitized along the way. So what is FADGI? First, what does it stand for? The Federal Agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative. There is a link down here. This has been work that's been underway for quite some time over the years to define, what is a good image and when do you need better images than lesser images. And so if you have any questions about that, QAI did put together a little bit of a briefing sheet on that. You can see the link there, and when you get the deck, you can connect to that. But basically what FADGI does is defines 4 quality levels of imaging from 1 to 4 stars. This is kind of the shorthand version of what's in all of that. It's a lot more complicated than my little simple slide here. Don will talk a little bit about some of the issues associated with, what does this mean, and what does it mean to do this at scale, and what does it mean to do this in a consistent and auditable kind of way, which is really at the heart of what FADGI is ultimately all about. I think sometimes there's a temptation to think of FADGI as maybe a badge that you stick on a scanner, but it's really about process. And that's really where Don is very expert. We'll give you a sense of, what we mean about process standards and how they apply to this area. So, as this standard is released and is finalized, if you can't meet these standards, there's a variety of different things that are in the standard in terms of what agencies need to do if they can't meet those new proposed quality standards for permanent records. And you can kind of get a sense of all of this. You can either send paper versions of the permanent records, prior to 12/31/2022. Keep in mind that the reason for that date is because that's when the M19 deadlines kick in. You can work with NARA to develop agency-specific record schedules that address particular problems. or can request an exception along the way. But the main thing is that it's been a long time coming, this question of what are the digitization standards for permanent records, and those standards in terms of quality ultimately reference back to FADGI 3 levels of quality. And so that's why we're talking about FADGI 3 today. So let me turn this over to Don, and I'll be the slide clicker along the way. And Don, why don't you take it away?
Okay, I'll just let you proceed to, there you go, that first slide. I'll start. Briefly, to add to John's comment, what is FADGI? I'm going to emphasize a couple of words here. It is a common and objective, that's the key, image quality set of guidelines based on ISO standards. So these standards, they tell us how to measure resolution, and they're ISO based, and they have been vetted forever. And there are numerous ones. I sit on the committees for the resolution ones. I was even the editor for that resolution, how to measure camera resolution. So that is the how, but it doesn't say, so basically you get a number out. At that point you say, well, is that a good number or not? Well, that is a value judgment, whether the number that comes out of these measurements is good, bad, or somewhere in between. And basically that's what FADGI is meant to do, is to provide some levels of goodness based on the numbers that come out of these ISO standards. So we say, okay, we have a resolution of X. Is that sufficient for the use case we're interested in? And basically that's FADGI. And we have these different, as we say, goodness levels, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1 stars, based on the use case and content types. So it is, in the best use of the word, a guideline. For us, for FADGI in particular, it is aimed at cultural heritage institutes. It is more than a narrative. It requires some tools in order to do these measurements and to provide feedback on what the numbers are. So somehow you have to put it into a machine, a ruler, we call it. It is. These are resolution, color, white balance rulers. We do this with what we call a target, and they measure, monitor, and help you interpret performance, accuracy, and precision. Those are two different items. Accuracy is the center of the bulls of the target, and precision is the scatter or the deviation around that. I always like to say precision actually trumps accuracy, because if everything is in a tight group, you can always do corrective actions with the entire batch afterwards. As long as you're, as I say, as long as you're not off the highway or into the gutter. At some point we say, well, we can't help you because you're too far off. But if things are tightly grouped and they're off what we call off of aim, oh, we can help you. That's the beauty of digital image processing. But beyond just the image quality, and it includes environmental, metadata, and content and camera specificity. As we mentioned, these are tiered levels of precision based on use case. Next, John. Some early work to give you some background. Where did this come from? The top one was a paper I did back in 2003. I have to admit, I did this out of frustration. I was still working at Kodak on the digital camera side, and there were a lot of competitors, and you would read the specs coming out of cameras. Oh, we have a 40 megapixel camera. We have a 30 megapixel camera. And I said, well, okay, you do, and that is what's delivered, but that's just data. Very quickly, if the image is coming off of them have been filtered through the bottom of a glass bottle, that's the lens, then it doesn't matter how many megapixels you have, it is a bad image because it's out of focus. So that is what we're starting to bring into this, is not only the quality, the quantity of the data, but the quality of the data. And that's the goodness levels. We did some follow-on work with the Library of Congress on how to start bringing those ideas into workflows and to how to set up QC processes to not just do it once, say, oh, out of the box, we measure it's good. It's well, things go wrong along the way. I always tell the story of when my sister asks me what I do, I mention, oh, well, let's say you turn on a scanner or a camera and you want to make sure it works right. And she says to me, well, you turn it on, what can go wrong? Well, everything goes wrong. Anybody knows that who owns a home. Everything can go wrong. So we started that. And then back in 2009, there's a little bit of work on preparing the community for what's expected over the next decade. We call it the image literate decade. And frankly, we're starting to transition out of that decade. We've done a lot of good work, I feel. There's still some stray items we have to fix up, but we've done a pretty good job on helping the user community understand what image quality is and what image literacy is. Next, John. Why should you care? Some people say, oh, image quality, oh, I know it when I see it. And that's what we're trying to prevent, because we don't care what you see. We want to know what the camera sees and how it is behaving. In fact, we want to take the viewer out of the picture because everybody has their own value judgments around what image quality is. We're going to come to a common point and normalize that with consistent image quality control procedures. And these are all drawn out of standard statistical processes that you see every day from any kind of manufactured goods. So this is more than pretty pictures. You are manufacturing images. This is the industrialization of image digitization. It's not your selfie. It is 140 pages a minute. This is fast and errors creep in everywhere. So there's more of a workflow idea around this. It's managing expectations. Did I really get a 400 DPI scan or not in terms of quality? Accurate metadata population. You'll see an example later on where when I look at an image, I say, okay, there's tags, there's data tags that go along with this, give information, descriptive metadata, they call it. Okay, it says that image is 72 DPI. And you say, no, it's not. That is an image of the Declaration of Independence. And I know it is not 4.5 inches wide. It is on the order of 16 inches wide. So these are the kinds of errors that can creep in. And the nice thing about these tools, these ISO standards, they are diagnostic. They're not just a number and say, well, figure it out. You can look at these numbers and curves and these functional forms and say, oh, you're sharpening too much. You've sharpened too much to the point where you've introduced more granularity or noise into the image. So this is why these tools work so well. It's effective communication. This is resolution. That's not resolution. And sharing. More than anything, the whole point of these standards is to scan once and make a repurposable master file from which you can then manipulate into the way you like it to look, but in an information sense. And that's what I'd like to emphasize. We're here to optimize information, not good looks. And I'll have a couple of anecdotes here. I was working with a customer and I said, you might want to contact that scanner manufacturer because I don't know what they sold you, but you didn't get what you asked for it. When they tried to remediate it, the customer support center said, well, does it look good? The customer said, I don't care if it looks good. I want to see the numbers, and that's what you should be doing. And finally, I had to give credit to Michael Horsley at National Archives for introducing me to the last bullet, and that is liability. So and he points me to this particular example in the next slide. John? This is why you should care. A lawsuit. Robinson versus McDonald. Robinson is the appellate. McDonald is the Veterans Affairs personnel. And pretty much, I'm not going to read all this, by the way, but basically, the appellate said, you lost my records. You didn't get them, or you scanned them poorly. So they took it to court. They worked through things, and basically, the courts came back and said, the appellate is right. You didn't have a quality control process in hand. And this is more than anything, we like to think of 99% accuracy. But when you crunch the numbers on those number of pages cited in that first bullet, 50 pages of those can be bad. And it just might happen to be the 50 pages you're interested in that will determine whether you get your VA check or your Social Security check. And so that's what all this is about, this is a final area of why you should care. These things do come to play, and they can bite you. Next slide, John. These are the quality metrics. You probably heard these terms on and off if you're anywhere, even with your standard cell phone camera. FADGI measures these metrics. These are overall metrics, and there's some subsets beneath them, but we talk about exposure. Is it a good white balance? Basically, is there a color cast or a tint to it? And the exposure is, oh, it's too light, it's too dark. Oh, it's too contrast, it's black and white. There's no gray tones in between. Noise. Are there a lot of granular structures or just variability within typically what should be uniform areas, like a sky? If you could look in the sky, when we normally visit, it's nice and clear, uniform. If you look at it with an image, you see variable structures in there. That is noise, what we call noise. Resolution. What is resolution? What isn't resolution? It's not just data. It's not just megapixels. It's not just DPI. It's actual optical resolution that has information in it. Now, I'll have a slide in the next set that'll show the difference between data and resolution, and how the viewer can be fooled by it because the way the human visual system filters that data. There's things like, we call them color registration errors, but if you look at it, we call it color fringing. That's what the geeks call it. If you look at an image, a digital image on a screen, and you see an edge, let's say an edge, you say, well, that's supposed to be just light gray and dark gray, but I see a little bit of gray or green tint along it. That's called color aberration. And that's where the red channel doesn't align with the green channel. Literally, they're shifted from one another, and so one is more dominant than the other. And then finally, this is a tough term. I call it color encoding accuracy. People call it just color accuracy. I prefer the term encoding accuracy, and let me tell you why. Because the way we look at image quality is we do not reproduce colors. We just look at the capture side with any of these metrics. We don't say, oh, how well is it reproduced? We're just saying, if I use a particular dictionary of what a value of 128, 150, and 200 is, those are just numbers. Those are digital count values. Those are not colors. In order to interpret and decode those into color, you have to have a dictionary. You say, what is this color? And there are 4 standard dictionaries that we use to interpret colors. You've heard of them, maybe. sRGB, Adobe RGB, ProPhoto, and ECI. They use that often in Europe. That's as geeky as I'm going to get about color. So next slide. Here's the big picture. Somehow you have to have the ruler, that's the target, with known values. So that item at the bottom left is, when I say a target, I said, oh, that's the ruler that has colors in it. It has resolution values. That's those little items in the center. And it has, you see that they're annotated with what the colors are in the real world. So as you go through this is basically the imaging chain. Okay, light hits the object, lens, sensor, and in the end, you get a digital image file. What you don't see here is, we're not looking at it on a screen. We're stopping right there and looking at a digital image file and using that target to go backwards. That's from one of our products is called Golden Thread. The idea behind that terminology is these targets in software are a thread from the digital file back to that original object. And we know that we can trace that back by knowing what the original object is via that target, or let's say it's not a perfect rendering of the original object, but it's close to it. And so we can never get it perfectly what the exact object is, but you say, these are some good tools or benchmarks to set. And that's what we use, a target, to set those benchmarks. This is often called, you can use this cocktail hours. You can call, this is called input referred image quality, meaning we're going to go back to the original, the input, and decide what is considered, how good the capture is in an information sense. Next. So very briefly, here is the typical target ruler, if you will, that is used on a scanner. It's in the lower left. I zoomed in that item on the top. Basically, we have grayscales, we have resolution rulers, we even have some human interpretable resolution features. Now I'll show you what those are here briefly. Scales, literally a dimensional scale. This is 1 inch, this is 1 centimeter. And those come in very handy, as basic as those are, those come in very handy to understand, did we really populate that metadata correctly? Are there really 300 pixels when I go in over this start point of 1 inch and the end point of 1 inch? That comes in very handy, believe it, as basic as that is. There's automated features in there. We use neutral gray backgrounds to understand uniformity, lighting uniformity. We want that entire target to be lit uniformly. We have colors, and we have gray patches to evaluate exposure. This particular one, you may have heard it from time to time, is called the Golden Thread device level target. So these establish ground truth of what the original object very nearly is. Next. I want to make sure I'm staying on time, John. Bump me up if I'm okay. So we scan that target. The software will read that in, and at the left-hand side, it will place what they call regions of interest over that target. We know that each of those regions of interest are specific to a particular metric. Those long rectangular ones are for resolution. Believe it or not, we look at how fast the gray levels transition from dark gray to light gray. If it's very fast in terms of number of pixels, that's high resolution. If it takes his good old time going from dark gray to light gray, lower resolution. And in the middle, we have a report. We said, okay, we measured everything, and here's, you can see, those are all the measurements I showed before. There's exposure, that's tone scale, white balance, et cetera, et cetera. So we measure all of those metrics and report whether or not they met the criteria for a particular FADGI level. I think this one in particular was for a 4-star. So upper right, you see that's what we call a tone scale curve. If you look on that x-axis, the horizontal, everything at the left, those are the light or white patches to gray to dark. And then the count values associated with those. That is a very nice, what they call gamma curve. I specifically pointed out that because these are guidelines, the M1921s are not considering those very, very dark patches. The reason for that is, frankly, for the kind of permanent records we're considering in M1921, you will never get content that is that dark. Those are very, very dark patches, the kind you usually only see in color photography. And then finally, on the bottom, we have the upper and lower, what we call goodness levels for that particular, I think that's the FADGI 3-star. What you want, we call these, somewhat facetiously, the corridors of tolerance. So you would like to have all of your data values within that red corridor. One of them popped out there, but that's okay. These are guidelines, and these are the kind of subjective judgments you have to make from time to time. But these are a good start of the objective ones. Next, John. Okay, so I'm always averse to just talking too much. So we're going to show you resolution. This is typically on top of people's mind. It's what is the quality of the data, of the resolution data. Here are some typical visual features on the targets that help you understand that. This is a perfect graphic, and there's 200 dots per inch, and you can see as you go down and down and down, the features get closer and closer. That means, as you might expect, that as you go from 200 to 400, the spacing between those bars in white is 1/400th of an inch. The idea here is when you image those through an actual camera scanner, that if you're imaging at 400 dots per inch, on the screen, you ought to see 5 bars, 5 black bars distinctly, without ambiguity. So in the next slide, John, we're going to show how you actually, I did a little experiment on a scanner. So along the x-axis, that's quantity. We actually collected that much data. 2, 3, 4, 600 dpi. Okay, so each of those has more data associated with it. And at the y-axis is the quality. We say, okay, now you can't see it because they're so blurred, but the annotations along the right-hand side of those go from 2, 3 to 400. Okay, so I'll keep that in mind. Sure enough, 200, we can see 5 bars distinctly. Okay, that's good. That's a real 200 DPI scan. 300. Okay, we go down. Okay, it just blurs out at 300. Okay, we'll give it a mulligan. We'll say, good. Okay, you did 300. That's a good 300. Now we're going to go to 400 scan. Notice it's still 300. You don't see 5 bars at 400. You don't see 5 bars at 600. So basically, those 400 and 600 DPI scans are just really 300 quality scans. So you're carrying a lot of data around that has no resolution quality to it. And that's why these standards are in place. Now, we don't use we call these sniff tests for visual, to give you sort of a good feel of what the real ISO standard way of doing it. So I'll just transition into the next slide and show you how you can be fooled. This was an image taken by a colleague of mine of a Paris train station. We have sharpness on the left, resolution on the right. Two different definitions. Sharpness is something the human observer sees and feels. And if you're looking at this, you probably say, yes, the one on the left is sharper. I like that better. But it carries less information. It carries less resolution information. If you look at the one on the right, what we did, that little clock sitting on that post, we zoomed in and we put it in center bottom of that target, of those images. Look at the minute marks on that clock. You can see much more distinctly the one on the right. So even though there was some sharpening applied to the left and it looks better, objectively, it has less information in it, less resolution information. And those graphs down below are, you'll hear this from time to time, they call those the spatial frequency response. We can go from the one on the right to the one on the left afterwards in post-processing, but you cannot go from the one on the left to the one on the right. It's a check valve. Because once it gets below that 10% mark, that curve, the data is unrecoverable. That's it. So this is why this is literally the technique we use for measuring real resolution in the standards. Next one, John. And finally, I mentioned this early on, simple sizing errors. I pulled this off of the web, yes. I said, oh, look at, here's the Declaration of Independence. Okay. We know that that is approximately 16 inches wide. I went into the metadata and it said, oh, it says it's for 200 DPI and it's only 4.5 inches wide. Well, we know that that content is not 4.5 inches wide. Okay, we know that because it's a popular piece of content, but stuff that we're not familiar with. I was always surprised at how small the Mona Lisa was based on images I've seen. And so this is why even the metadata is important. By the way, notice, these are the visual cues. Look at the little white shadowing that goes on around those dark letters. That is called over sharpening. That is, sometimes you hear it as haloing. Without even looking at the objective data, you say, oh, they have sharpened everything out of that content. So, and that is what, and we manage over sharpening, by the way, in the FADGI criteria. Next, John. So how does all this occur? It's the Digital Conformance Evaluation Program, DICE. It provides the measurement and monitoring components of FADGI. So it's the tooling around FADGI. And it also applies to the NARA draft digitization regulations. Two components, targets and analysis software. So those are the tools. And they're designed to comply with the ISO specifications at all the federal agencies and outside vendors. Some agencies follow this closely, others less so, but whatever they do have the targets and processes in place. Next, John. And in summary, these guidelines, both the NARA ones and the strict FADGI ones, are now included in many federal and regional contract requirements. We're now finding even that many internationals are adopting these. There used to be another set of guidelines out of Europe, but they're no longer actively supported. And so we've learned that just like anything, you've got to keep up support and keep it as a living document. We often get feedback to say, oh, this is tough. How are we ever going to do this? Not really. They are achievable. These are not onerous guidelines. I provide coaching to vendors on these items, And with a couple of webinars, we say, no, you have to do this, not that. Once we get the language between us settled, we say, oh, it is largely sometimes a vocabulary thing. Say, oh, this is what you mean by that. And we have many scanner vendors now able to comply with at least the image quality portions of these. I'm not a data management guy, but on the image quality side, that is my expertise. They are very useful in detecting and diagnosing poor and variable imaging performance. So the key there is we don't measure this just once. In a workflow, you have to continue to do this session to session, day by day, some level of periodic checking of compliance, because things do go wrong. Despite not thinking that it will, things do go wrong. And so where do we start? A good target is a great starting point. I hope I didn't go over, John.
You did great. Thank you very much, Don. I really appreciate that. It was, I love that one of the Paris train station and the difference between resolution and sharpness, because I'm constantly taking my images on my phone and sharpening them, thinking that I'm doing something productive from a resolution perspective, when I'm really not. So
okay, well, just give me that phone, John. We'll take it away from you.
So there's some questions popped up, and if other folks have questions, hit the question button. We'll try to get to as many as possible now or during the course of this webinar, or else we'll come back after the fact. But let me switch gears to Scott, and kind of you can give a little bit of a take on some of the thoughts that you've had after being in the scanning and capture business for a gazillion years. What does this mean to you, and what do you think some of the pitfalls are that people are going to run into?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, gazillion years. That's a long time, but still having a lot of fun at this. So it doesn't quite feel like a gazillion years yet, but this is the challenge, right? And so as you heard from Don, I think a few of the takeaways are, that this is a process, right? That there's tools that get introduced to this process. One of which is an analysis tool, and the other one is a targeting tool. And Don used the word measurement, and I think that's an important takeaway from this webinar. John, you used the word at scale, and that's a real live word when we're talking about high production environments. This one slide that I have displayed here are actually images from one of our BPO centers here in the Maryland area. And the challenge that we run into in the effort to try and comply with these standards is all these different devices and all these different mediums that come into our facilities. The few images there, share with you that the capability of doing, books that are still with their spine intact, or oversized documents, or we're processing film and fiche and that kind of thing, or we're truly working on very, very high speed processes that are bringing lots of images across the devices. What's the possibility of actually being FADGI 3-star compliant in this environment? The answer is it's very possible. It takes time. The one takeaway again that Don had shared was the reoccurrence of the check-in process. How often are you going to test these devices to determine if there's been any changes? And I have all these type of devices. What does that look like? How do I train my operators? How do I get my innovation team squared away with a new process and making sure that the quality management folks are aware of what to do and how frequently they should do it? So there's a bit of an undertaking here. And I think was the purpose of this webinar is to begin to point that out, that there are folks out here, such as ourselves, that understand what's involved in getting there. But I think the at-scale piece has certainly brought us quite a bit of challenge. So I want to make sure that some of the folks that joined us feel as though they're not alone out there in this market to try and figure this out. So if you could switch to the next slide, John. I know that Don had a lot of the technical components covered. So to make this more of a practical discussion, I just wanted to talk quickly about what are the most popular questions that we get asked of QAI today as it relates to FADGI. So let's go through a few of these. I know we don't have a lot of time to spend on each one of these, but are the documents my agency has already scanned FADGI 3-star compliant? Meaning we didn't do anything to ensure that they were, but we want to know if they are or not. Does my agency just need to purchase new scanners? This is a misconception in the marketplace. Do I, if I were to buy new hardware that is suggested it's FADGI 3-star compatible, do I meet these NARA and OMB requirements? Is there a software that will render old images and make them FADGI compatible? This is a question that we get asked quite often. And I think if you just, moderately heard what Don had to say, you'd realize that that's not the case. Who can come to our agency and explain all of this? We get asked this question pretty often. Seems like it's really involved. We work with agencies that have large digital transformation groups, and we have other groups that work really at the departmental level of their scanning, whether it's centralized or decentralized. They're moving in this direction, and the consideration for becoming FADGI compliant is something at least being moderately talked about in certain cases, and has become very popular in other cases, and in some certain cases not being talked about at all. So I want to make sure that this audience is aware that if you fall into any of those categories, you still seem to be within the range of all the things we see currently. Next question, will NARA accept our images that are not FADGI 3-star compatible as permanent records? Well, John mentioned the word earlier, essentially. And as the guidelines exist today, NARA's guideline is suggesting that the images that are being submitted for purposes of permanent record are essentially compatible with FADGI 3-star. So, that's an important thing to be aware of. Some of the processes that work on today, very fast, very involved, a lot of resources in place to help get this information across these scanners digitized. The population of the metadata occurs very quickly, and ultimately it becomes actionable. And so one of the questions that comes to us quite often is our effort to become FADGI 3-star compliant going to slow down our current process? And if so, to what degree? And this is a real thing, because for many years, a lot of these agencies have been working to identify the efficiencies within their process and make things go faster. And they want to know whether the adoption of this standard is intended to take them backwards. So next slide, John. I just wanted to point out, I know Don had a lot of the technical pieces covered and certainly was intended to talk a bit about, Golden Thread, its software and its usability within the market. I wanted to point out some of the practical questions that come into an organization like QAI. If you're unfamiliar with who QAI is, we run national BPO centers. We do a lot of systems integration work around the capture space, and we are finding that these FADGI requirements are becoming ever more popular. And so we're teaming with Don and his company, as well as a variety of hardware IP partners. All of these folks are in play. That one question that I mentioned a little bit earlier in the previous slide, who's out there to help us? Well, it's guys like us, and it's folks like Don, and the combination of all of our talents and resources and so forth are what's in place in the market today to help our clients get through solving this challenge. So thanks, John, for including us.
Thank you very much. You guys have time for a couple questions?
Sure.
So the first one that I wanted to ask is this has no basis in the, like when those people do financial statements and they say that these forward-looking statements are not based on any empirical, all those kinds of like caveats. This is just a handicapping question I'm curious about that was raised is, what do you think is going to happen to the M1921 deadlines? Will they be extended? And just a quick guess, understanding that none of us have any inside information. I think they will. How about you guys?
Yeah, the question comes up in every bridge meeting, and for every opportunity it can be asked, it is asked. Lawrence Brewer, is front and center, I think, on how OMB is going to take the consideration of that. I would say it's going to be extended. That's the direction that I suspect things are going, but that's our unofficial statement.
How about you, Don? What's your guess?
I agree. Yes. I was surprised myself when I said, end of 2022? Wow.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. So other questions that popped up here is, this is kind of an interesting one, is, and you alluded to this, Don, but maybe you could talk a little bit about it, is, do you think that this will start to extend outside the federal government into other image quality arenas? And for me, what I kind of think about is sometimes is like when DoD 5015.2 in the records management arena, all of a sudden started popping up in all these different RFPs all over the place, even for ones that didn't have anything to do with DoD. And I wonder about this from an image quality perspective, whether this will start to happen.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I have to admit, it's a little scary. Even outside of the US, so I think the implication you mentioned is, US specific. We are finding this is filling a vacuum outside of the US. Europe, Japan, Australia are starting to adopt these same kind of rules, guidelines. But even if I go outside of the cultural heritage community or data management, we do know that all these same standards we've cited in the presentation, they're being used for cell phones, autonomous vehicles, medical. So all these other marketing sectors are using these same standards. The ones we've described here are, I will say, because I am in touch with the other communities, these are the most comprehensive. You will see, I'll use the example of cell phone cameras. They will typically, they're more resolution specific. So they have a very specific quality metrics that they consider important. What we're looking at is, we're looking at everything. And so the answer to your question is yes.
It's really interesting to think about that, because that, as you say, the part, I can't remember what the phrase was you used on earlier, but it was like, don't trust the way something appears, look to the data. And when you think about the fact that what we're actually doing is, this is a manufacturing environment in which we are manufacturing digital artifacts and digital images. And I think if you think about it that way, then, it puts a whole different cast, I think, on how you think about this.
Yeah, there's always been an artistic spin to a lot of the cultural heritage that we're saying, okay, that's nice, but you have such volumes here. And in fact, I share with my colleagues, it's hard to impress upon them the sheer volume of stuff that needs to be digitized. And I say, you've got to take a real industrial approach to this.
And maybe this is both for Scott and Don. There's a question here that ties to this whole question about, like, will agencies try to do this themselves? Will they rely on their BPO partners to do this? How do you think that will all shake out eventually?
Scott?
Well, the one slide that I had would suggest to you that we are getting a lot of questions from agencies who are looking not necessarily to outsource the entirety of this new process that they want to potentially consider undertaking, but they're looking for advice, and they're looking for various levels of expertise to clarify the what it is that they're expected to be doing, and really just to understand, if this isn't about just the scanner and it is a process, what does that look like within the environment that we have currently? And that's where that series of questions continues to sort of build on itself once they begin to understand what it is that they're undertaking. So I don't know. There could be certainly a lot more cases where people say, hey, we're just going to outsource this to the likes of a Konica Minolta QAI type of facility. But I think there'll be an equal level of interest of folks just looking for the guidance and bringing and adopting what these new practices and processes are. And so I think, John, there'll be a combination of both.
So we're running out of time here. I'd like you to think about some parting words for the audience in just a second, in terms of like one key takeaway that you want to make sure that people remember from this conversation. Understanding that this is the first in probably a series of conversations that we'll have about this moving forward, and particularly as the regs wind up being finalized. But first question is there any central repository, if you will, about scan? A lot of scanner manufacturers are kind of looking at this now and determining that they are FADGI 3-star capable. Is there? I'm not saying certified, because we already said it's a process standard, not a hardware standard. But in terms of capability, is there any central place where all that is listed anywhere? And I know you're probably a little reluctant to name particular scanner manufacturers. If you're fine with that, go ahead. But is there any? If somebody wants to look this up somewhere, is there a place they can look it up? Sounds like no.
It hasn't reached that maturity level yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess for any of the scanner friends out there, maybe send us an email about different particular models that you believe are FADGI 3 capable, and we can kind of like sort of package all that up in the follow-up materials to people. So maybe a takeaway for you all. Last question I wanted to ask before asking you for just a parting thought is, we talked about this being a process standard that needs to be validated at intervals, in order to make sure that the image quality is still sustaining at the original level. Is there any take, Don, on like what does that mean? Is that weekly? Is that monthly? Is what does that mean?
Well, that's a good question. My boilerplate answer to that has typically been start twice a day, morning or at the beginning of every session.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Well, I've noticed, if you consider an 8-hour day, let's figure, typically it's, you come in the morning, people go to lunch, and you're coming in the afternoon. And I've always noticed that it is in transitions, people transitions, day transitions, meeting transitions, that's where the errors creep in, is when people are no longer in the flow. So we say, start one morning, one afternoon. If it's still fine, you're getting consistent results, then back off. You say, just do it once a day. And let's see how that. So I try to take a decremented approach instead of an incremented one. Mm-hmm.
Good answer, and more frequent than I would have thought. So thank you for that. Scott, maybe one key thing that you want to make sure people don't forget.
Well, I think it was mentioned a number of different times throughout the last hour, which is, if you came to this thinking, I need to buy new scanners and I need to get new equipment and modernize my fleet, hopefully your takeaway is to come to realize that this is a process, right? And it's about an analysis of something, and it's about the measuring of something. And while the devices, by the way, are very, very critical, to the success of this effort, it's a bit more involved than that. And yeah, so that would be my single one. John, you mentioned, us building on this as a part 2, part 3 type thing. And so I think we'll, as we go on over time, we may even end up showing some of what Don was just talking about, right? What does that check-in process look like for an operator, and get people to become even more so familiar with how is this going to change my environment? So
great. Don, your parting words.
Oh, my parting words. Yeah, you told me I was supposed to be prepared for this. This is going to sound self-serving a bit, but it was actually the last bullet of my last slide, is to at least get going on this, you need some kind of a ruler. Okay, to build a cabinet, you need a ruler. Yes, it is that simple. You can't just and consistent with my second slide was some background of how all this evolved. It was it's the article about debunking of specsmanship. Somehow you do not just believe the marketing specs. I always say, here, okay. I always say this even on my high speed,
we got 12 this time.
Now we got 12. Okay. Boy, this is embarrassing. Okay. Well, at least the cat didn't get up here. Okay. When you buy a house, you get it inspected. When you buy a $150,000 scanner, make sure it works right. And that was my takeaway, is if you get something, make sure, manage your expectations, and be sure you get what you pay for. It is that simple.
Awesome.
I had an example with a library in Ohio where they had me come in. They said, we're going to put this in. I asked that it has to be FADGI 3-star. We spent 6 hours with the installer trying to make it FADGI 3-star. The manager came in at the end of the day. How are we doing? I said, we didn't meet the spec. He would not cut the check to the manufacturer. He said, you fix it or you don't get the check. It's that simple.
Awesome. Get what you buy. Get what you pay for.
Yeah.
John, let me tail off with one other comment to that. And people ask, like, where are we going to be with this? Well, it's pretty operator involved. Obviously, we introducing the target sheet and getting results, and then making a determination of the pass fail. If we look at our industry as a whole, we're all about automation and making things faster and more efficient, right? That's really a lot of what we've been working on over the last decade or more. With software and so forth. So how integrated will this process, and this might be a great segue to our part 2, John, how integrated will this process that we're describing become to the scanner, and less involvement from the operator themselves, right? So the idea is will the hardware device be capable of telling us whether it's passing or failing, without having a lot of involvement from the operator? So we'll leave that for kind of our next session, but I think everything about forward thinking and looking at our industry in a way that it evolves, that's something we can be talking about in future state.
Thank you guys a lot.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent, Scott. You're right. And it can be done. Yes.
It was really fun. Thank you guys for your time. Thank the audience. We will be sending a recording of this around to folks, so feel free to share it with your colleagues. And if you have any questions at all about any of this, then let us know, and we'll see if we can follow up in person. So thank you guys a lot.
Right. Thank you, audience. Appreciate it.